Awesome. Thanks, Eric. So we're going to start off, we're going to kind of get our hands dirty. You know, one of the things we wanted to do today was to get a representative slice of what people across campus are doing in education. And so we thought, you know, it'd be great to start with somebody who has a lot of experience using AI tools in the classroom. And so we're super happy to have Shen Shen, you can come up, Shen Shen. So Shen Shen is a lecturer in ECS. She is teaches some of our largest classes in machine learning, introduction to machine learning. So not only is she an expert in the technology that we're talking about, but she also has really, because she has been teaching these very large classes, thought a lot about how these AI tools can be used in the classroom to help, you know, with the experience of teaching students, and also to help streamline her own sort of work processes as a professor. And so she's really going to show us, I think, what some of the potential for AI as a tool is in teaching. So it's going to start off, it's going to be a little bit technical, but it's fun, I promise. So thank you, Shen Shen, for doing it.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim and Eric, for the invitation. So maybe we can move on to the slides. Cool. Okay. So let me see if the mic. Okay. So I'm going to talk about what I'm going to talk about today is, well, I'm going to share some experiences and a lot of reflections on some of the experiments that I've been running in this, as Sam mentioned, large-scale machine learning courses. Most of the experiments are coming from this introductory course taken by mostly junior and sophomore students, half of which is coming from Course 6 EECS, but we also get representative students from all the departments, actually, from MIT, I think, because AI is, you know, so trendy and such a hot topic right now. I want to be clear that this talk is not a survey, it's not a prescription, it's just a bunch of stories and reflections, and hopefully it can offer some sort of a local view and a lens that you might want to, you know, take whatever is fitting for your own context. So to get started, I want to first maybe frame the problem a little. I think as I organized my own thoughts, I thought, well, it might be helpful to think about how AI as a tool or as this sort of a new fancy, flashy new thing could show up in teaching. Well, maybe we could think about how AI usage could happen in teaching in two axes. One is, you know, is it student-facing, all the way to staff or instructor-facing. One is the more vertical axis, where, you know, is AI coming in helping our routine activities in teaching or the more creative workflow. And of course, you know, almost all things that could happen in teaching could nicely map into these two axes, right? So, of course, grading logistics, that's staff-facing, that's very routine, whereby, you know, curriculum design, syllabus design, what goes into lectures in what sequence, those would all be staff-facing and very creative. So to sort of navigate around this two-dimensional space, I'm going to follow this plan for the talk, where I'm going to first start with a case where it's very clean, where AI usage is just going to be a pure win. I think it's a very compelling story where I would hope everybody would embrace AI in that space or in that region, in that two-dimensional space. Then I'm going to start to talk about where we are observing some sort of a pressure, or how does AI change or challenge the thinking of how we sort of conduct our teaching, and how the system or our course has adapted based on, you know, empirical evidences or some sort of internal thinking. And then finally, I'm going to end with somewhat of a small surprise that happened alongside those explorations. We didn't expect or design for that last piece to emerge, but alas, it came out, and we were pretty excited about that last piece as well. So to to get started, the first piece, right, the where AI is a pure win, I think it's very clear, at least to me, the biggest leverage that I've had observed is just staff-facing creative workflow. It really unleashed a creativity, and I'm just going to use my own experience in creating the introductory machine learning lectures as an example. It totally changed how I would structure or how I would design and polish my lectures, for example. Right, so I'm going to start with a sort of a quick fire hose of just a workflow rundown, and then I'm going to focus on two particularly, I think, interesting use cases. Well, nowadays, when I design my lectures, I no longer sort of just think alone or sit alone and then just tweak my slides. I actively interact with AI, right? So I would be able to now brainstorm analogies. I would be able to strategize, the flow of the lecture, iteratively chatting with AI, strategize the design, ask AI to critique my slides, iteratively sending it my PDF, saying things like, okay, please critique my slides, be critical. Oftentimes AI would be, started off with some polite comments about, oh yeah, this is a really great slides, and then you iteratively poke it a little bit about, okay, I didn't really like that piece of transition. Could you maybe help me, focus on improving that part? This sort of co-design process, I would ask AI to generate script because that forces AI to narrate or give me a coherent storytelling, which in my experience has been the more challenging part of teaching. The math part, the sort of the duration, the technical part it seems to be a lot easier once you know what you want to talk about. And the sort of the designing, the higher level piecing together the storytelling, AI has been really, really helpful. AI has also changed how I would actually, implement my slides. I now have this tool of vibe coding my slides, where I used to have to manually change all of these attributes of my slides to make these animations, which has been a very tedious process in the old days, but now with AI, I can just give it a few examples showing that, okay, so this is an iterative algorithm. I want to repeat this process a few times, so then this idea sticks to my students, right? So maybe, you do this one more time. I do it one time, you do it multiple times. Right? So now this becomes a lot more streamlined thanks to AI, similarly, right? So for a lot of these iterative or repetitive animations, the efficiency and productivity boost has just been phenomenal. So now I do want to talk about two special use cases, which I thought is a little less routine. One is that, last term I started using basically a dump of my slides and my homework materials coming from the course and the notes, all the materials surrounding a topic. I would just dump them into AI and then create a podcast. Well, the sort of the twist of the story is that, of course, the podcast itself is not the end product or why I'm creating the podcast, but rather that, since podcast, there's typically two hosts, there's a bit of a back and forth, there are two voices. It really helped me finding sort of an alternative voice, but also this kind of handoff moment, because when two hosts are chatting, there's oftentimes exchange. One person would prompt a question, the other would naturally just carry on the conversation, and I found that to be a particularly useful sort of reference whereby I might, just steal their sort of handoff moment. I'll throw those questions to my students. Where, if they answer my question, that's great. If they don't, then I also have sort of a natural follow-up where I might quickly adapt on the fly, answer my own question without it feeling so embarrassing or awkward. So that's one thing that AI enabled that was previously impossible. I didn't have a partner where I could practice this sort of back and forth. I thought that's pretty interesting. A second use case has to do with this somewhat of a technical story, where on the top there we have this formula that's a central piece for the early few weeks of our course. Some of you might recognize, right? So that's a formula for ordinary least square regression formula. It's is a very important formula, but it has also been traditionally very notoriously dry. We try to convince our students it's very important to really appreciate this formula, to understand that when things go from scalar to vector to matrices, sometimes intuition would go across the board, sometimes the algebra would break. But it has been somewhat of a challenging to motivate students to care about this somewhat dry formula. So as it happens, last term, when this lecture was happening, it coincided with Career Week, and a lot of our students and staff, they were sporting this free T-shirt from the fashion brand that is Jane Street. So Jane Street gave out these T-shirts, and then I thought, hey, no, there we are. We have this. I saw our opportunity. I thought, okay, maybe I could use this to tell stories, asking things about, what's probably wrong about this T-shirt, because this T-shirt formula is a variation of the top formula there, but the T-shirt formula could only make sense when X is a vector. Basically, it's a special case of the more general formula that we care about. So I thought I could ask this provocative question so as to get my students to care about this dry piece of math. But then there's, of course, that somewhat of a fragile point in this whole storytelling idea, which is the T-shirt formula used a different notation than our notation, right? So it's not only a special case of our formula whereby it only works for vectors, it also is using a different notation. So in the old days, I probably would just abandon the idea because I'd rather be boring than confusing. I didn't want to get into explaining the notation. But with AI, I could easily, right, just change the notation so then my story or my point gets across really, really cleanly. So I get sort of to be a little bit both fun and clean and clear and precise. And this is another piece of really sort of previously impossible kind of creation that AI enabled me to do. So while similar to how now, yes? I don't know.
Yeah, but use the microphones.
Sure? Sure? Yes. Yes. So use the microphone. Oh.
Oh, sorry. So when I'm thinking about lecture content, sometimes I'll hang out with chat a little bit.
Chat, yes.
But then I feel like a little bit of a fraud because the students are here to learn from my ideas and not its ideas. How do you square that?
Reconcile?
And yeah, how do you reconcile that? And do you disclose that to the students? Like parts of this lecture were generated.
Well,
and then my
okay.
my second question, which you can address later, is I'd love to get your workflow for some of these things, right?
Okay,
so,
sure.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, okay, sure. So first question is, do I disclose, or I guess I don't fully disclose because I don't really think of those ideas that I bounced off of ChatGPT as ChatGPT's idea. This might sound like territorial or like, oh, is this really your idea? But I think especially for the intro level course, the core material is really just almost out there in the public domain, right? A lot of these AI systems, they might have just been trained on those materials to begin with. So I think I think how I teach this machine learning course differs from how other people teach other machine learning courses, not really in the technical content, but really in how I sort of morph together the story arcs, how I motivate them. And a lot of those, I don't really think ChatGPT would be able to generate on its own. Some of it is insight-driven, some of it is historical data-driven. For example, right, that dry piece of math, it's because we've observed that that seems to be a fragile point in past iterations that prompted us asking the question and iteratively improved later on. I think also this is going to be a central theme along the talk. I think the final product, I don't really think it's ChatGPT generated. Maybe no, the animation sequence, that's ChatGPT generated. Those I do disclose, but I don't think that's the focal. Yeah, of course, the code. Yeah, right. Claude, write you some code. You co-author with Claude. That you certainly disclose. But this sort of kind of dirty and a hairy design process. It's both hard to disclose, and also I think it's kind of the sort of muddies the point. So those I don't really say, okay, the story that I told you, for example, right, that joke thing, I actually did practice letting ChatGPT sort of critique my joke, but I thought maybe I don't have to say that ChatGPT helped me land the punchline cleanly. so that sort of thing. And then workflow, right? Workflow, yeah, I'm going to comment on that towards the end. I think workflow is probably awesome. Oh, yeah, privacy. Probably not the focal point. At least I don't think it has to be. Okay, anyhow, so right, so this is a clear win case. I think it really boosts your efficiency, your productivity, but also opens up new opportunities for you to be, for me at least, to be creative. And I've also observed that the similar sort of opening up new opportunities also happened for my students. So, of course, everybody would observe students using AI. And one of the most memorable moments for me in observing my students' sort of AI usage happened in office hours. So this was a different class, a master's student level class that I also taught. This class has a project component. And during this office hour, well, it started normal, right? So a student came by, asked me a question. I gave the student some answers. But then something strange happened. Then the student just, without leaving the room, just abandoned me, turned around, started typing my answer into ChatGPT, sort of just having a side conversation going on with me in the room, by his side. So, and then, he chatted with ChatGPT with my answer for a while, and then, came back to me with a follow-up question. And this sort of iteration happened for a few rounds. Of course, I was very, very curious, right? So this was a very new experience for me. So I asked, what are you doing? Not in a confrontational way, really just, why, you're here, I'm here, the two of us are here. Why do we have this three-way conversation? So a few comments came back from the students. So first, they were like, your response was a little technical for me. I didn't really fully understand your explanation, but I also don't really know what I would want to ask as the follow-up. So I'm just using ChatGPT to parse your answer a little bit, to also kind of hide the noise, because I want to get the most sort of insight from you. So I want ChatGPT to filter out the non-necessary bits, or the sort of the bits that I could maybe go back and offline search on my own. So there's a little bit of post-processing happening. And I think he also mentioned that ChatGPT, well, it really helped him sort of verbalize his question a little bit better. So, basically he's using ChatGPT as a sidekick to ask better questions. So that was a very new experience for me, it got me thinking. A lot of thoughts, immediately went into my head. First, the curiosity, but also, wow, this seems to be a very creative way of using AI. I probably wouldn't have thought of, using it this way myself. So maybe I should think or pause a little bit if I ever want to prescribe how my students should use AI. But one other thing that entered my mind was that, well, maybe because of AI, I should really now rethink about a lot of things that I would used to take as the norm, right? So I used to think office hours is just a bunch of, one-on-one question and answer sessions. That seems to have changed. Actually, along that line, a lot of things have changed. Well, AI actually shifted a lot of things, and in particular, it shifted where learning signals become visible. So learning perhaps is still happening, and students are probably just using a different set of tools to learn. But from the observer end, from the sort of instructor end, I've certainly observed that how we detect the learning that certainly has changed. I'm going to use two examples, right? So. One, again, a little bit more advanced courses. So in particular, from that, that incidence of the office hour, which happened in the master level course, I observed that a lot of the project execution, when students handed in the project, they are on par, the quality of those projects, they are on par with some of the PhD projects that I had previously seen in a course that I taught prior to AI becoming this mainstream sort of tool. In other words, what I used to rely as this strong proxy for understanding the project execution, the artifacts produced in projects, things like the results table, the algorithm, the claims, the analysis, all of those seems to now be flattened out. The signal that I can read from those proxies is no longer as strong. In other words, some of the judgment has to move a little bit higher along the chain, a little bit more upstream, where I should now probe a little bit more into the design choices, into what has been some of the challenges you faced, how did you encounter or bypass or overcome those challenges. So that's the sort of signal inflation thing that I've observed. Similarly, I've also observed in a lot of these introductory courses, the signals are also changing, but then they come in the form of a little bit delayed effect. In particular, I now observe students feeling very confident and comfortable. They know the material, especially when it comes to sort of the routine type of tasks, where if it's doing some algebra, if it's visualizing some high-dimensional space, because nowadays a lot of those answers are handed or served to students in such beautifully formatted, nicely explained, so patiently explained, step-by-step sort of recipe. It's very easy to fall under this illusion that, okay, just because I'm nodding along with this answer, I understood this given answer, I might be able to just generate an answer when I'm in a new situation, right? The good old training versus testing kind of a gap. I think AI has certainly made that a little bit more too comfortable to think that you understand something when you are really just agreeing with something. It's similar how sometimes I would watch a cooking show, seeing that the host is mentioning, oh, here's the recipe, here are the steps, and I thought, oh yes, I could cook that dish. I can really not. Right? So this has shown up over and over again in our introductory course. And how we adapted that is that while we didn't really reinvent any new mechanism, we also didn't really try anything drastic, but rather we just try to adapt locally on things that we were already doing. And for that, I need to mention the introductory course, we have this component called lab checkoff. So it might sound a unique thing, in our class, but it's really just a group sort of interview, like a discussion where a student would form groups and talk with staff after they've read some piece of code or some piece of conceptual prompt, staff would come by to the group and have a little bit of interview-like conversation with students to see, okay, hey, what have you observed? What are some conclusions? How does that connect to things that we discussed in other class meetings that we had in this class? So in some way, I think you can think of this as structured office hours. And we've always had this lab checkoffs in our class long before AI has become sort of the hot topic in recent years. So what we did after observing that signals has changed, the immediate question that we asked was not that how should we stop students from using AI? There's no stopping it. It's just going to be a failing battle. We instead asked how could we somehow make those signals surface a little sooner, or make those signal to noise ratio higher, right? So how could we read off of the diagnostic behavior? Towards that, now we try things like, we train our staff better. We ask explicitly our staff to try these questions, right? So here, what I'm showing here is 2 questions and 2 sort of scripted or talking points that we used to give our staff, give our TAs and LAs. Now we ask them, just try to put the questions into ChatGPT, see what kind of AI response it would generate. And in anticipation of those answers, try to come up with really good probing questions that you can ask students in those follow-up exchanges. And the goal there, of course, is really just to turn those moments where students might be hiding or sort of too comfortably sitting behind a shield that AI created for them, making them believe that they understood those concepts. We wanted our staff to be able to nicely probe those out and turning those moments into both a learning opportunity, whereby if there's confusion, they can clear that up right on the spot, as well as sort of a checkpoint. If you didn't really understand this piece, you wouldn't be able to answer those very improvisational sort of follow-up questions. So we thought that has worked really well, and along the way of asking our TAs and LAs to do that, we also observed sort of this community building where TAs are now sharing their knowledge to our lab assistants who are typically a lot younger, a lot less experienced. So the adaptation, right? So the last piece that I want to talk about actually happened alongside this moving judgment or detection of a learning signal upstream, where now if we rely on the whole staff, especially what's changed is we are now relying more heavily on our junior lab assistants to detect and diagnose learning signals. Well, what emerged alongside it is, AI and also moving this judgment upstream really changed who could deeply participate in teaching. You already saw the snapshot, right? So when we do this lab checkoffs, we gave our TAs and LAs somewhat of a guide, somewhat of a talking points, right? So in some previous years, it could very well be the case where LAs might just follow some script, right? So they know that those are the technical points, those are the easy, concrete things that they need to sort of check off in the conversation. But now that they are in the mode of actually interactively or actively thinking about what to ask or what to probe, it's creating somewhat a more judgmental or creative workload on them. So at first we thought, well, this might be AI making it more difficult for especially the junior teaching staff to participate deeply in teaching. But what came out, and as I mentioned, the small surprise is actually, on the contrary, AI actually helped making sort of training and onboarding our junior staff a lot easier. And that has to do with how AI took away a lot of the more sort of mundane, routine, and boring workflow from the whole operation of teaching. For example, in old days, whenever we have a new LA coming on board, it's quite of an operational cost to assign the job, assigning a TA to be the mentor, letting the TA pass along their knowledge, a lot of coordination, a lot of logistical cost associated with running this course, which, by the way, typically would have about 50 LAs and 20 TAs, right? So it in itself is kind of at the scale of running a course. So in the old days, even when we wanted to somehow empower our LAs, a lot of the operational cost would just be so challenging to bypass, because sometimes you have to prioritize, what has to be running smoothly versus what would be great to have. So, for example, in the old days, right? So we would have to dedicate manpower, human manpower, on things like understanding the different modalities of data that we would collect, things like the year our students are in, the exam stats, the exam sources, how to create good exam questions, how to answer some of the mundane email questions, policy clarification questions. Those would require the dedicated staff time and energy. And all of those, thanks to AI, I now can deploy a private and local secure AI system in a small cluster in my office that can really just automate a lot of these workflows so that, for example, when a policy clarification email comes in, an AI draft a clarification, make it easy so then, the staff responsible for replying can really just read the draft, either agreeing and then just one click to send, or quickly change a few words. And the system also adapts on the fly when new information comes in. For example, when along the way, maybe because of the bad weather, we change our attendance policy or something, all of those would really be handled automatically. So with that, a big piece of the routine stuff now taken care of, empowered by AI. Now we also observe sort of this ripple through effect where now the sort of mid-level staff member have more bandwidth to pass along their wisdom. So here's a stat bar in our course repository, right? So a few years ago, you see that only a handful of teaching staff would be able to deeply participate in creating new materials, mostly TAs and instructors. But now in this past term, we observed a big boom in who wanted to participate deeply, who wanted to actively fix a typo, propose new ideas, implement a new question. And a lot of that is thanks to TAs now also actively leveraging AI, right? So TAs now can quickly summarize, what's the typical workflow, what has been the typical questions that we have encountered in previous year's office hours, what would be some high-level idea that we might want to, implement. So, you see here, it's created by a bot with the TA proofreading the summary, and then, you see a huge list of our LAs participating, all different people, all sort of putting in small bits of contribution in making this lab better. And in fact, towards the end, AI even comes in sort of proofreading and caught a small typo that all of our human staff didn't previously catch. So in a way, and because of how AI made the judgment or judgmenting the process necessary to happen upstream, a lot of the routine stuff, organically being handled by AI, we now have more a contribution or scalability for the more creative workflow. So now I think maybe I'll summarize a little, right? So across these different experiments, what really made me sort of going back and reflect on, how or where AI could really be helpful, or what actually carried leverage. I think for me personally, I feel like the biggest gain is really sort of where judgment can leave. Not really what tools do we choose to use? How do we use AI to amplify judgment? How do we use AI to empowering the junior staff to exert exercise their own judgment? Making execution cheap didn't really remove judgment for both sides, right? It didn't make learning algebra or learning, programming languages unnecessary for students. It's just made, the learning signal a little bit sort of muffed or delayed. And then lastly, once judgment was sort of placed deliberately, small adaptations really had a big scalability effect that we didn't expect previously, thanks to AI. So with all of that, I do want to end on somewhat of maybe a more forward-looking or broad stroke, right? So there's this quote that, like all internet quotes, oftentimes are attributed to Einstein. I don't know if he really said that, but I think this is a really good quote. So it says, education is whatever's left when we've forgotten everything that we've learned in school. And I've always really liked that quote, but I think nowadays it's especially true because actually AI would accelerate that forgetting. Because just yesterday I was, I was working on my my server, I needed a command. I totally forgot what that command is. I really just typed in natural language and asked a cloud to execute it for me. Right? So part of me is forgetting faster, but I also feel like maybe that would free me up and open up, as I mentioned, open up new opportunities for me. So I think what we should really do and think deeply about when we teach students is probably no longer what they are probably going to forget safely in a few years, but not the knowledge or the skills, but really sort of the good judgment and the motivation to really be comfortable in exercising those judgment. That's all I have. Thank you.
I know this is not generalizable, but in your experience, how often does AI suggestions for improving your slides actually, from your judgment, improve them versus, no, really, nah, not worth it?
Right. Yeah, so some of it is a baseline, right? So maybe, for example, I do have a few lectures that I really think, started as terrible. So maybe, the story arc is not that smooth, the time allocation is not that great. So for those very operational type of fix, I think AI is really, really great. I think maybe because how it's trained, right? It's seeing very polished work on the internet, because people typically would post their best work on the internet. So those things that AI has seen is pretty much well organized. But when I really have to start from scratch, that's where the AI suggestion is a little all over the place, right? Sometimes it would judge the audience a little too hastily. Sometimes it would suggest examples that are either too mainstream or too obscure. So sort of that kind of unconcrete prompts are a little harder to just get at face value from the AI response. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks. These ideas are so fascinating.
Thank you.
I feel like I understand the point you were making early on about how the greater access to superficial fluency makes judgment and understanding sort of less visible.
Mm-hmm.
And how that leads you to move judgment upstream and develop the depth of understanding of teaching assistants, for example. I didn't quite understand the point you made towards the end about how judgment can become more visible through this process, and I wanted to
right. So, for example, I feel like the way that we train our LAs, I think they now become a little bit more, advanced critical thinkers than we would have previously had, right? So now they not only just passively listen for an answer and then, maybe the worst type of LAs might just, read off of a bunch of talking points. They now also actively think about how I listen and how I respond. So I think there's a little bit of judgment going on there. But I also feel like, a lot of us would really learn from who we interact with and how they responded to whatever we did. For example, suppose I'm a student. I really just used AI to create my response. But if I saw an LA who actively listened to my response and very visibly are trying to help me find the understanding gap in my own reasoning, I feel like as a student, I might really appreciate that and try to take a step back and reflect on, okay, maybe I should try to be more like that LA. I think a lot of these sort of, very vague, very kind of almost like personality type of training, I think can really only happen through human interaction. And a lot of that, really is judging which part of it do I want to outsource to AI, right? Do I want to outsource my thinking to AI, or do I just want to outsource, this piece of really tedious Linux command to AI, right? So that part of it is really, you made that decision, but how do you make that decision? Maybe it cannot be dictated. especially kids, they wouldn't really just listen to like a dictation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, hi. Oh, hi, Jacob. Hi.
So I want to make sure I captured the point you were making about these in-class interviews or in-lab interviews. It sounds like for an AI system, you give it questions, it comes up with answers, and then you test it by seeing if it can generalize to other circumstances. You give it a different scenario. And now you're saying that in interviews, you can't learn anything by just asking students to answer the question you gave them. You have to actually ask them to generalize. Is that an accurate statement of what you were saying about how the interview process changed?
Somewhat. I think you can still just judge by how eloquently they are giving you the response.
Except you said AI was giving them these eloquent responses that they can just parrot back.
Right. If they're really just parroting, then yes. And if you are sure that they're just parroting whatever is scripted, then you do need to probe a little beyond, their training data. But that seems to be the extreme case. Most of the students would, even if they did use AI to help them generate some of the answers, they still try to internalize a little bit of the high-level conceptual answer. They still try to pass it on as if, it's entirely theirs. So I think, how to detect the confidence is also part of what we are training the LAs to be better at.
I see. So you don't think it's necessary for every interview to include some attempt to see if the student can generalize beyond the questions they were asked in, say, the lab write-up?
Probably not every question, because sometimes the generalization would just happen naturally. Sometimes, when the dialogue is happening, the student might, just stump because they can't really just, read off of a script. They might just stumble on parts that weren't really theirs. And once that happens, then, the LAs, we tell them, okay, probe on that a little further.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to return to the point you made earlier on about learning signals and the changes you're observing. You're making a distinction between something you called inflation in advanced work and delay in the more introductory. And it seemed to me what you were calling out is just the artifacts, student-produced artifacts that we used to use for assessing weren't trustworthy in the same way. It felt like that was collapsing to me into sort of the same thing. Could you unpack the distinction you're trying to make there a little bit more?
Right,
please?
right. Yes, I think to some extent, yes, the artifacts that students are making is no longer as telling as they used to be, but I would still categorize that as inflation, because I think, for example, in introductory courses, you will still catch the gap in understanding in exams. It's just that, those typically would happen, especially, for if we follow the old tempo, oftentimes, midterm or the final exams, those signal would surface, right? Once they, have a closed book exam, whatever they didn't really understand would show up in the exam answers. But now, because of the delayed surfacing, they might be going into the class for like half the term thinking that they are really doing well because, maybe because, they agreed with the answers, they were able to implement things. They had this false sense of security, but then it's really because the exam, for example, happened a little late, or if we didn't intervene in time or help them in time in those check-off conversations. So that's what I meant by, so I think there is a slight distinction there.
Okay, thanks. Something? Go ahead.
I'm short. This is amazing.
Oh,
really,
thank you.
Very, very, very helpful for a lot of the stuff I am doing. I have like a bunch of little questions.
Sure thing.
So one is the workflow you have to optimize. It'd be wonderful if you recorded how you set that up, or is there a place that we could go to figure out how to set it up? Because I think a lot of people might not know
Right.
exactly how to do that for their own circumstances
Right,
and all the
right.
different classes at MIT.
I needed to comment on that. So I think it's a little sort of at this time, right? So right now in January 2026, that workflow is still somewhat of a geeky setup, right? So there is a little bit of a barrier there. But I also feel like the tools, it's very duct taped together. It's just a small server that I have in the office. But I also feel like along the trend of AI liberating a lot of workflow, I fully expect AI there might be a startup very soon that really just lets you self-host your own whatever you prompt. I wanted my AI to say answer my emails. Here's a bunch of emails. I want it to be secure. I want it to be private. Blah blah. So you just give the very high level specification. I fully expect AI might be able to just create certain products like that. But I also wanted to comment on how nowadays a lot of the we had this AI encoding workshop a few days ago, right? So nowadays a lot of the software engineering industry. I feel like Lincoln might be rolling his grave. A lot of the code is now written with AI, sometimes by AI, but also now for AI. If you read some of the repositories, you don't see instructions written for humans anymore. You just see, hey, cloud or Codex, here's how you would deploy this system. So all of that is to say, I didn't want to get into the details of how I implemented those workflows because I really fully expect those workflows is going to be everywhere very soon. But I'll be very happy to share whatever breadcrumbs that might be helpful.
Just to implement next semester, It's
sure, of course.
That startup is not out and commercialized yet. The other thing is, one of you can elaborate how you used AI to help the TAs guess what the students were going to already find out and then probe them deeper, because that's a great method to know that the students are going to use it, but let them have a deeper level of understanding. And then how do you know whether or not they're going to parrot what they're saying, and how do you change what kind of questions you're asking, knowing that it's part of how they're doing their homework. Their own time. So if we could hyperlink on that'd be great.
Right. So
Thank you.
We were very fortunate that our course is run every semester, and we have a sort of a high retention rate of veteran staff members. So what we concretely do is we ask during staff meeting, we pair veteran TAs with the junior, the younger, the new LAs, and ask ask them to role play. So, for example, first the more advanced or more experienced TA would fake answers by giving those AI generated answers, and then if the LA already can ask a good follow-up question, that's great. If not, then maybe the TA could help train the LAs a little bit by giving them hints about, okay, here this particularly in this answer, what part of it seems to suggest to me as AI generated, and give them signals as to where to improve. So this role play, again, not only helping with the sort of the technical implementation of the idea we're trying, but also community building. So now, for example, my LAs really, tell me that, I wanted to come back to this course, staff this course, because I like that TA. So that seems to have all sorts of side benefits.
Amazing. And any tips on telling whether they're parodying it or whether they really have absorbed it and can then exercise judgment in the future, whether they've actually... You
mean the TA, LA, or the students?
Both. Mainly the student is what I was thinking of.
So for students, like Jacob was suggesting, right? So trying to go a delta beyond what's the obvious. That seems to be
right, I mean,
that seems to be
basic, but what's
that
the
seems
next
to be
level?
Good. Yeah, that seems to be the next level. I think also sort of trying to ask follow-up questions on, hey, how does this piece of question remind you for other pieces of materials that happened elsewhere?
Connections.
Connections.
Not just generalization, but also can you connect it to other? Within
the course material type of connections, that's not exactly on this web page, right? So asking them somewhat of, does this remind you of the testing point that we try to get across in that homework question?
I got it.
Kind of thing.
Thank you.
Of course.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just ask one question. So do you think, after all this, do you think your students are learning better or worse in the era of AI?
I think this might be a somewhat of a controversial claim. I think think AI is in some sense like a multiplier, right? So it somewhat depends on your initial condition. If you're a positive thinking person, right? So it really amplifies your learning. If you really just want to find ways around the uncomfortable confrontation of your own gap in understanding, AI would really agree with you in the way that made you think that you really are good, which sort of a downward spiral. So it's like a compound interest, depending on is your bank account positive or negative to begin with. And that is somewhat kicking the ball down the lane, right? So when they came to MIT, some part of their personality is already framed, especially now that a lot of them are born with AI. Basically, AI is their first language, unlike us who are trying to adapt to AI. So it's a little hard for me to give a quantitative answer as to is the proportion of students, how does that change? But I do think the good students are learning way better with AI, whereas the opposite side is probably learning way worse. But I think the gap is magnified so much by AI. But I think it's more important that we try to somehow adjust the initial condition, and I also do think that adjustment is not really a technical question anymore. It's really how do you motivate them to care about the boring stuff that things like. For example, when I was a kid, right, so my parents would tell me, you really should eat vegetable every day. Now I don't do that every day, but it's because I'm now mature enough to understand the things, the boundary of where an absolute statement would end. But in earlier days, how do you instill that kind of somewhat challenging belief to students is probably way more important now because of the magnifying effect of AI.
That's a great answer. Do you have any thoughts about how you perturb that initial condition?
Right. So using myself as an example, right? So I'm somewhat still young. I think I think of myself still as a young person, and even though my mom keeps telling me otherwise. So for example, of course I think it's kind of clear that I really like AI for the things that it did very well. But when I think about my role models or who I would go to for really important, say, life decisions or really important sort of high-level human kind of questions, I still wouldn't rely totally on AI. Or in other words, I have a lot of heroes, who are really technical, who's great professors and alike. I would fully expect, on any particular topic, AI might know way more than they do, might be able to explain the technicality better than they would being able to me, but I still would want to be more like my role models. I don't really want to be like ChatGPT. I do want to be friends with ChatGPT. I want to, talk to him, but I don't want to be like him. A collection of knowledge that seems to be not something I want to be. And I think if I have this sort of sensibility, I just hope that I could pass that along to my students, where you really view AI as a really helpful friend who's really knowledgeable. But at the end, you are still an independent person. You should have your own standing in the whole world.
Was there a question over there?
Yes.
We'll do one.
Oh, okay.
I just have one quick question. It was just about, to your point about how good students get better, bad students get worse. Does that mean in the whole, there's going to be just a bigger gap between people who understand things and people who misunderstand things? We're here in this guardrail with good students, good teachers. There are a lot of places that don't have that and are still using AI without that.
I personally, I feel like so. Because, there's some discussion about how AI nowadays is taken as, you could almost think of it as utility, right? So there's a lot of fairness discussion and also, political discussion on how AI is now making electricity more expensive because we are competing with the AI for that sort of very fundamental human resources. But I think just like all the tools or all the technological revolution happened in history, right? Oftentimes it would also be a flipping point or a watershed of if. I think I also remember this quote about how in the future it's unclear if our students are going to be replaced by AI, but it's very clear that probably our students are going to be replaced by students who can use AI to their advantage or best. I thought that seems to resonate with me very strongly.
Is there time still? I just wanted to comment. Number one, I very much appreciate the generosity of spirit with which you speak about your students and the way they use AI. I think there's a lot of sort of vilification that I hear from teachers and professors about kids who are trying to get away with things. And I was really struck by your statement about if they agree with the statement that the AI has generated, they think they understand. I think that's an incredibly important thing for us to push into. And I guess my question, thinking about the gap, the magnification of the gap that you've mentioned, are there ways that we can encourage students to even make use of AI to, I think there's a lot of shame associated with the student who has those foundational gaps and does not know how to overcome them, and so is putting up a facade of competence. Does that make sense to say it that way?
Yep.
I wonder to what extent we can plumb the potential of AI to help those students overcome those foundational gaps. Do you see that? You know what I'm saying? To ask it then, help me figure out what I don't know.
Who helped you figure
For
out?
a student to ask the AI to help them figure out what they lack so they can overcome the shame. Does that make sense? So they can lessen that gap for themselves individually. Yeah, is there a way we can encourage students to use it as a useful tool?
So I think there might be confounding variables there, right? So if it's really sort of uncomfortableness or I don't want to face it, even though I know that's the right thing to do. But then there's also the case where they generally just don't believe that that's the right thing to do. I think for the latter case, it's going to be way harder, and I don't have an immediate answer other than. Other than sort of the environment probably would be the only place where, or some sort of peer pressure. Everybody is trying to be better. Maybe I should too. That seems to be the only way I can think of. But for students who know that they want to be better, but just don't know where they can find the resources or what concrete steps they can take to get better. I think to Joe's point, us sharing how we use AI is perhaps really helpful because I take no shame in finding weak points in my lecture. Disclosing that AI wrote this piece of code and why. Sometimes I would mention in lecture, hey, AI wrote this. Why did I let AI write this instead of me writing it? Well, because it's a boilerplate thing. It's not really creative. That sort of bits normalizes the usage, but I also think it somewhat contextualizes why you, the more mature entity, made those the choices, and then that might push them a little.
Let's thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.